We expect one or more of my colleagues to arrive after other conflicting committee meetings. I'm going to ask that item 2, 4, and 5 be placed on consent, but we'll hold that vote until another committee member is here. So we'll begin with item number 1.
Very good. Item number 1, City Controller reports relative to its performance audit of and semi-annual follow-up to the blueprint for a comprehensive citywide anti-gang strategy.
We have a representative from the Controller's office to present the follow-up report on this.
Hi, good afternoon. Sarah Glick with the Controller's office.
Cynthia Varela with the Controller's office.
2 weeks ago, on July 27th, the Controller's office issued our second follow-up to the blueprint for a comprehensive citywide anti-gang strategy, which was released in February 2008. The overall objective of the second follow-up audit was to assess the status of the recommendations which were not yet implemented as of our first follow-up audit, which was issued in February 2009, 1 year after the blueprint was issued. So I'll first start with a summary of the initial blueprint and of the findings of the first follow-up. The initial blueprint provided an assessment of the city's social service and gang prevention programs and made over 120 recommendations for implementing a new citywide anti-gang strategy. The primary recommendations of the blueprint included creating a single office to coordinate citywide anti-gang strategies, building upon and developing regional partnerships with LAUSD, the county, and other local governments, conducting needs assessments, reinventing the city's general youth and family services, redirecting funds to the gang reduction strategy, and establishing rigorous performance measures and conducting comprehensive program evaluations. The first follow-up audit found that the GRID office had taken critical initial steps towards establishing the necessary processes and organizational structure to address the blueprint's recommendations. However, at the time of that initial audit, the first follow-up, most of the recommendations were still in progress of being implemented. In general, this second follow-up review found that the GRID office has made progress in several key areas since the first follow-up, but has not completed a comprehensive evaluation of program results as was anticipated. Specifically, we found that the mayor's office made progress to more fully develop the organizational infrastructure of the GRID office. For example, since the first follow-up, the GRID office expanded the number of fill positions. They also reorganized to improve their operational efficiency and effectiveness. In addition, the GRID office executed all of its contracts with their intervention and prevention service providers in all 12 GRID zones, and then also with service providers in non-GRID zones. The GRID office also implemented the Los Angeles Violence Training Academy, which is designed to help professionalize the intervention services and the workers. They also created multidisciplinary teams in each GRID zone. The purpose of these multidisciplinary teams is to bring together professionals from different local agencies to case manage individual clients by sharing information, collaborating on strategies, and helping participants overcome barriers to services. The GRID office also established a formal protocol for monitoring its contractors and completed several rounds of site visits. We assessed the monitoring activities and noted both some strong points and some areas that needed improvement. In particular, we found that the GRID office must ensure that their program monitoring support evaluation efforts, particularly by ensuring all necessary data and information is being collected and that it is accurate. The GRID office also must strengthen its processes for ensuring that its lead agencies are conducting timely and sufficient reviews of their subcontractors. So one of the recommendations of the blueprint was to develop a separate gang reduction unit to coordinate, track, and leverage all of the cities and the regional programs aimed at at-risk youth and communities. In response, the GRID office established the GRID cabinet. which includes representatives of all city departments with a focus on anti-gang services, as well as LUSD and the county. However, it does not appear that the Grid Cabinet has effectively met the intent of the blueprint's recommendation. Specifically, we found that the Grid Cabinet does not have a clear focus or purpose, nor are its members' roles and responsibilities clearly defined. These issues were also noted in the first follow-up audit. However, subsequent to our field work, the Grid Office held a retreat on May 26th and May 27th for its cabinet members to address some of these issues. During that retreat, the Grid Cabinet members developed a draft mission statement and corresponding goals, and also identified 3 specific projects on which they could collaborate and leverage each other's resources. We also found that the role of the Grid Advisory Committees, which are in each of the 12 grid zones, needs to be strengthened. The Grid Office established these advisory committees to provide input on the Grid Office's service delivery system, to help them identify partnerships, and to provide information for effective program implementation. Similar to the Cabinet, we found that not all advisory committees appear to have a clear purpose, nor are they effectively meeting the stated intent. We also noted that members of each advisory committee in the grid zones varied. Therefore, not all the key players, including LUSD, CDD, and Rec and Parks, are represented in each grid zone. In some cases, we found that only Grid Office staff and their contracted service providers were attending the meetings, while other advisory committees included participation from LEPD, LUSD, and community members. Inconsistency in the purpose, structure, and participants ultimately limit the effectiveness of this initiative. In addition to assessing the city's anti-gang programs, the blueprint also assessed CDD's youth and family programs and made recommendations for improvement. Specifically, the blueprint found that many of the city's programs administered by CDD were disjointed and failed to leverage appropriate resources. As a result, CDD's system for providing youth and family services resulted in unnecessary overlaps, inefficiencies, and gaps in services. The blueprint recommended that CDD's youth and family programs be consolidated with the anti-gang programs to ensure that these programs operated in a coordinated manner. As we noted in our first follow-up, the city decided to keep the anti-gang and general youth and family services separate. However, to address the issues noted in the blueprint, CDD reorganized its operations and completely overhauled its human services delivery system. While it's too early to adequately assess the effectiveness of CDD's efforts, it appears that this reorganization, if implemented, if the changes are implemented as planned over the long run, that they will address many of the blueprint's concerns. The last point I'll talk about has to do with the program evaluation of the grid programs. We hired the firm, the Evaluation and Training Institute, as our subject matter expert to help us assess the evaluation activities of the grid programs. Unfortunately, nobody from ETI could attend today, so I'll just presenting the information and doing my best to answer any of the technical questions you may have at the end. So the Grid Office hired the Urban Institute to conduct an evaluation of its programs. The initial contract with the Urban Institute was executed in April 2009, and it outlined a series of tasks that were to be completed by March 2010, including a final evaluation report. However, the GRID program encountered several implementation challenges that hindered the Urban Institute's first-year evaluation activities. Once it became apparent that these tasks and that the Urban Institute's proposed research design was not feasible, the Urban Institute did not submit, nor did the GRID office ask for, a revised scope of work. In addition, as of our field work, the GRID office and the Urban Institute had not yet made a decision about an alternate research design, which is normally done shortly after challenges to an existing research design are identified by an evaluator. In addition, our subject matter expert found that other evaluation activities could have been implemented during that time. Despite the setbacks and the fact that no comprehensive program evaluation results are expected in the near future, GRID paid the contracted evaluator more than $500,000. However, subsequent to our fieldwork, the Urban Institute completed zone profiles for each of the 12 GRID zones. Urban Institute also reassessed the risk factors for joining games for a small sample of youth in 6 GRID prevention programs. However, it is unclear how useful these profiles and the assessment results will be, since the GRID is in the process of implementing a new standardized model for its prevention programs. The GRID office must strengthen its oversight of the program evaluation to ensure that the evaluation progresses in a timely manner. The GRID office must also respond quickly to any additional setbacks and make appropriate decisions on alternate evaluation methods to ensure the program evaluation moves forward smoothly. It is imperative that the office demonstrate to city leaders and the public that its programs are an effective and efficient use of city resources and that they are achieving the desired results. To assist in this, we recommend that the GRID office consider developing in-house expertise in program evaluation to adequately oversee, monitor, and provide guidance on the Urban Institute's performance evaluation activities.
Well, my main concern, based on what you discussed, is the lack of an adequately carried out contract by the Urban Institute and lack of useful evaluation. I'm not sure if I should ask questions of you or of a representative from the mayor's office on where it stands and why it's been allowed to stay where it is. Do we have a representative from the mayor's office that can answer those questions?
Do you want us to
Thank
sit
you.
down?
Yeah, why don't you do that? I'll call you back up if I have any other questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Guillermo Céspedes. I'm the director of the Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development. There are representatives here from the Urban Institute, as well as our director of fiscal and administrative services, and our manager of planning and evaluation services.
Okay. I'm not sure if I should ask questions of you or Urban Institute or a combination of both, but it sounds like, and Mr. Parks is now joining us, it sounds like this is almost thrown out money. It sounds like we spent $500,000 and didn't receive a usable evaluation that we can actually access in a way that we can tell whether this money is well spent, whether the program is effective, whether it should continue to be funded by the city and stay in the mayor's office. What did we receive for our $500,000? And if we're not able to get the kind of evaluation we need, why do we not have a plan to get that evaluation?
Well, if I may, I'd like to make some brief remarks both about what we have accomplished, what we've put in place by way of corrective action, and some of the things that have been formalized as a way of moving forward.
Well, let's make this 2 steps. First, why don't you respond to the controller in general about the program, but then my specific concerns that the actual evaluation has not been done in an effective way, and we haven't.
Yes, which one would you like me to do first?
Why don't you start first with the overview of the program and how you think it's doing, and then ask
the overview.
Have her question second.
In the last 2 years, we have made tremendous progress in establishing 12 gang reduction youth development zones. That means these are areas that have approximately about a 400% higher level of crime than other areas. And we did so that to more effectively target resources. I will go through 2 program components that we have implemented in those areas that we believe have been highly effective. One is that we contracted with community intervention services providers in each one of those grid zones. They're a team of 9. And the goal of these services is to drive down gang-related violence, and here's how it's done. Each grid program manager has a BlackBerry that receives a racer notification from LAPD. Each intervention member of that team has a BlackBerry that receives the same racer notification. Both grid program manager, intervention worker, and LAPD respond to that incident simultaneously. This is every single shooting, whether it's a homicide. In fact, most of the time we don't know if it's gang-related or not until we respond. We have been doing that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the last 2 years. The result of that is that currently in those zones, gang-related violence as of this week, because we get data every week, it's 11% down, and Part 1 violent crime is 10.5% down. Therefore, the strategy of driving down gang-related violence in these particular grid zones that are highly impacted is working. The next component is prevention rather. The task of prevention is to choose 10 to 15-year-olds that, based on research, are at the highest level of risk for gang joining. This is not a decision that gets made just by observation, but there is an actual tool that measures the risk factors and therefore determines eligibility for services. To date, over 4,500 youth have been evaluated citywide and are receiving, the number that are receiving services exceeds over 50% of that. And it's the part of the strategy that I think is really the hardest for the public to understand, so I like to explain it in somewhat simple terms. These risk factors, I think of them as a fever. By that I mean a referral source may look at a youth and by observation decide that this youth may be at risk of gang joining. Pretty much the way a parent would put his or her hand on a child's forehead and determine whether they have a fever. That child then gets referred to an agency, and that agency will put the child through a structured interview referred to as a youth service eligibility tool, and one of the designers of the youth service eligibility tool, Dr. Karen Hennigan, is here if you would like more information about that. And that risk tool measures the level of elevation of those risk factors. In other words, think of it as a thermometer. They measure the level of the fever. The contractor provides the medicine to reduce the fever. This has never been done in the city of LA. It is the first time that this approach is being used nationally. We have just received the first round of testing or retest of these youth. Something else we have done that I think has been, so therefore we feel that the prevention component is very much on track, despite some delays, and that the initial retest shows that we are moving in the right direction. Our summer reduction strategy, which gets a lot of press, but it is a summer reduction strategy that gets implemented from July 4th to Labor Day weekend, Wednesday through Saturday, 7 p.m. to midnight, has been expanded to 24 sites. That was not a part of the original design. It became implemented in 2008, and the data for both 2008 and 2009 shows that that program is effective in reducing gang-related violence and other forms of crime in those areas. In 2009, there was a 25% reduction in homicide, 19% in reduction in aggravated assaults. Therefore, I feel strongly that our summer strategy is working during the time of the year that crime spikes the most. As far as intervention, one of the mandates of our office was to establish accountability and professional standards for intervention workers. So we established the Los Angeles Violence Intervention Training Academy, the only comprehensive training academy for intervention workers in the country. This is not a place where you go and take a course. This is a place where you go and take a basic course to get your certification, and then you're mandated as an intervention worker to take continuing education modules every year to maintain your certification. In addition to that, the Academy has a professional standards committee. It has a curriculum development committee. In other words, it's a learning platform, and it's not a place to just take a course. There have been challenges, and we have responded to those challenges in the following way. We have gathered available data. We consulted with national experts, and we articulated the grid model of practice, which had been one of the obstacles in fully moving forward with a more effective evaluation process. This is not a model that was just picked out of thin air, but in other words, we used the data that was provided by the Urban Institute. We used the grid zone analysis that was provided by the Urban Institute, and we use feedback from providers in the field to develop this model. In addition, I personally directly spent quite a bit of time with founders of these various models of practice that we are implementing. In addition, so therefore, we feel that that obstacle that has been raised as something that needed to be corrected, that we have addressed. And that will be included in the action plan that will be submitted to the Controller's Office by August 27th. We also have articulated, because with evaluation, most of the providers that we use are neither familiar with evaluation, they live in, they perform in gang-impacted communities. They tend to be, for the most part, somewhat suspicious of outsiders. Getting an evaluation, a true evaluation design and collaboration with some of these providers has been challenging. Therefore, we've made it contractually mandated, specifically what are the things that these providers need to participate in order to make the evaluation more effective. Another issue raised by the Controller's report is the issue of internal capacity. We're currently interviewing a research director that will serve as a liaison to work internally as part of GRID, but also to serve as the point of contact with the Urban Institute. Data has just arrived that from the first year evaluation report, which was not available at the time of the field work of the Controller's report. And for intervention, we have established a formal ComStat to hold intervention workers even more accountable. The GRID cabinet has been restructured to meet with the requirements outlined in the Controller's report, as will the advisory committees. So, in short, we don't feel that this has been money wasted. We feel that it has guided the development of the strategy for year 2, and that yes, there have been delays. Some of those delays have been due to issues with providers, transitions from one chief to another that made data gathering delayed, and issues with our data collection system. However, we have gotten a final report. We have gotten preliminary testing data from the Urban Institute, and we feel strongly that we are ready to move forward in a way that would satisfy the concerns of the Controller's report.
So we actually now have a final report?
Yes, we do, sir. That just arrived today, this morning.
So nothing has been evaluated from that final report? We really don't...
Well, in the final report, what has been evaluated, and perhaps Morgan Lyons from Urban Institute can provide more details on that. What has been evaluated is that we've gotten grid zone analysis, an analysis of each grid zone, which I've reviewed those, analysis of the initial pilot testing of youth across 6 grid zones, proposed evaluation design for year 2. Yes, those are the areas that have been covered. Generally, as I said, I received that report today.
Now, what was asked for in the $500,000 contract, and what have you actually received? Have you received in this final report everything that you originally contracted for?
I believe we have, sir. I believe we have. I think that the only thing we have not received is a comprehensive testing of all of the youth throughout all of the grid zones. But we have gotten initial data. We've gotten grid zone analysis data. The LAPD data, I'm not sure if that's included in the report. I need to read that today.
Wonder if I could ask the Controller's Office to give their take on what's been received so far. And don't go away, but maybe we can...
Luckily, I brought a copy of the contract of the what was expected in the first year. So in the first year, there was 4 tasks that were expected, and that was an assessment of the grid program implementation process, an evaluation at the individual level, which is how I see it, this retest of the risk factors for the youth for the prevention programs falls under the individual level, but that's also on a kind of a smaller sample-based scale. The third was a community level assessment using community level data, and I don't believe that has been completed. And then also a cost-benefit analysis. Also, I don't believe has been completed, but correct me if I'm wrong. And also, I just want to note that the initial contract was for, I believe, $900,000. So as of, when we conducted our audit, about $500,000 had been paid, but the total contract was for $900,000.
So am I safe in assuming that we wouldn't pay that full amount until we received all the different elements of the contract, and we expect for that to happen?
That is correct.
So from the controller's point of view, how on track are we? Is it compared to where we expected to be at this point? And
I think that according to the contract, if you're just looking at what was in the contract, we would have expected them to be further along. And as we said in our report, that once these challenges were identified back in last summer, just about, that it was at that time when the grid office should have revised the scope of work and then made it clear that, okay, this is actually not realistic based on what the challenges we've identified, that this is really what we should expect this first year, and this is what we would expect to pay out for these tasks. It was really that they didn't kind of then revise what they expected based on the challenges that they encountered.
And was that ever done?
There were some revisions made, and I think when they say the revised scope of work, it has to do with the evaluation design. There's been a lot of discussion over the last, and again, UI can speak to that as well. What is an appropriate evaluation design? We ran into issues with using control groups. And there is now an evaluation design that has been proposed and accepted to move forward with.
So from the controller's standpoint, what would you suggest we attempt to do to guide this in the right direction?
Well, as we recommended, I think it would be helpful if they did have some in-house expertise on program evaluation, which the grid office agrees with. But to help them kind of move this along, and it's going to take better oversight to make sure that things do move forward smoothly by the grid office.
Is the grid program moving in this direction or planning to move in this direction?
Yes, it is. We are, in fact, interviewing. We've come to a tentative agreement with a evaluator who will work with us internally. Our plan is fully to submit a plan of action, corrective action, to the controller's report by the 27th, and to continue working with the controller's report to make sure that that accountability is as effective as it is being demanded of us.
And a question on the actual efficiency of the agency. My understanding is that the grid increased its staff from 22 employees to 37 as part of an effort to streamline the program. How does that jive with the actual streamlining? And I understand the budget wasn't increased in this process, so does that mean you replaced higher paid workers with lower paid workers? How did this all happen?
Well, part of that, we inherited certain positions from the consolidation of other services. So we inherited the YWAR program, which has 4 positions attached to that. We have been working for about a year and a half with 3 positions, or maybe a year, 2 to 3 positions that were open that we had not been able to fill. So part of that increase in capacity, some of those positions were already allocated, and some of those positions we inherited.
I'm not sure that gives me any clarity on how you went from 22 to 37 positions without increasing your budget.
Our budget was already, and again,
You budgeted for those 37 to begin
we
with?
were not budgeted for 37 positions. I'm not sure that we have, that that's the exact number. We hired program managers that were not, those positions were allocated, and they had not been filled, and we inherited 4 positions from YWAR, and we hired, I believe, 2 additional accountants.
I'm not sure I've got any clarification on the question I'm asking. If you added 15 people, and you were fulfilling your budget with 15 fewer people, how'd you pay for them?
Some of those are grant-funded positions, some were positions that were already allocated, and some were positions that we inherited, and I will need to get back to you with exactly which position is which. That's an area of the office that I don't oversee.
So you might have gotten some additional grants to pay for
Correct.
some of these folks.
Correct,
over
and,
above.
and we have several grants that I would gladly come back before you and specify those.
Yeah, that would be good to know a little bit more about that. Mr. Parks, do you have any questions?
I was just wondering, follow up on that question, is that some of that increase of personnel, could that be paid for by your rollover funds?
Well, yes, because we expanded the Summer Night Lights team, and those positions are being paid over with savings that we had from the year before.
Because this is what, the 3rd year?
This is the 3rd year, correct, sir?
So we're approaching, what, $60 million that we've spent?
We're entering our 3rd year.
Okay. Is that about $60 million that we're spending over
Yes,
3
sir.
years? Okay. The one thing I was wondering, and I don't know if the controller has access to this, is that many of the things that you talk about in your audit appear very similar to your evaluation of bridges as it was disassembled. And what we expressed was a concern when the audit was done about bridges, that if we didn't have a criteria to evaluate, we would just be giving money to new friends. And we now are at our 3rd year. We have people that are being funded, and we know more about them than we did about bridges.
I'd like to make a correction, sir. I don't believe that we have spent $60 million. I took over the office in September of '09, and so what has happened from the very beginning, that I would also love to be able to provide to you.
At the end of this fiscal year, you've been averaging about $18 million a year.
I don't believe we were fully funded the first year.
I think you were.
Okay.
But I just want to know, have you done any comparison on bridges versus this report?
No, we haven't.
It just sounds very similar. And that report on bridges drove us in this direction.
Right.
And so we're 3 years into it, and it sounds, if you just took out the word bridges and replaced it, it sounds very similar.
I certainly hope that's not the case. And it sounds like that the grid office is getting on the right path to get this evaluation.
We believe we are.
Yeah. But see, the dilemma we've had, at least from my perspective, is that when we talk about the audits and the criteria, we could actually fulfill all the commitments of the audit and still not be successful in the community. And so there's got to be two parts of, yes, we've hit the ABCs of the audit, but is it actually making a difference? And one of the things, and I don't know if we were in this room, but when we discussed it early on in public safety, we were told that the $800,000 to $900,000 we spent on the first audit, we were guaranteed, and that was the one that Connie Rice did, we were guaranteed that out of that $800,000, we would get a evaluation tools that would tell us where and how we should spend the money. And I think what came out of that audit is a phrase that said, we're working in silos, and next thing you know, we are moving towards developing another structure, but did not get a evaluation. And then we spent over $500,000 for Laura Chick to do an audit, and we were guaranteed there'd be an assessment tool. And what we got out of that was, let's put it all in one place. And so we spent, from my recollection, about 1.5 million, and we just did an audit in this year, and we said, you know what, we don't have an assessment tool. I just don't know how you can spend that kind of money on two audits or two programs and then spend on our verge of spending 60 million in 3 years, and we're about where we were with bridges, from my perspective. So I just don't understand, that's exactly why we put a footnote in the budget.
Sir,
Let me finish. We put a footnote in the budget to say maybe it should be joint supervision of these dollars, because we just don't quite know what's going on. We know the money's being spent. We still don't know how much the rollover has been for the last 2 years. So we don't know if it's 18 or is it approaching 20 million per year because we're rolling money over. But we still do not have a clear picture of if and how we're successful. And if we look at the controller's news conference and we read her report and then we hear the presentation today, it's like we're not in the same city. We got some very different views of our success. And that was one of the concerns when we moved that money to the mayor's office and said, do we lose control? Do we lose insight? And I can just tell you from my perspective out in the community, we generally see these prevention and intervention folks after an incident occurred. We rarely see them before. The other issue that my staff complains about is when we have a program like Summer Night Lights, we generally get converged on by gang intervention people saying, can you help us get people to Summer Night Lights? Well, from our perspective, if they're out in the field doing what we're paying them to do, they shouldn't be asking us to help them gather people up for a program. They should have a ready Rolodex to get people to almost anything they're doing. And so I'm still in a quandary as to, are we, and we can all say we're making progress. And again, there's probably at least 6 or 7 agencies in the city that will all take credit for the gang reduction and crime reduction. And none of them will take credit when it goes back up. And so the issue is, and we know crime is cyclical, and it will eventually go up, and nobody will come up and say, it's my fault. The issue is, but everybody has said they're responsible for the crime reduction. And that's, nice as long as it's going down. But again, when it starts going up, all of this money we're spending, we're going to eventually have to come to grips with, did it work, or did we just hit a cycle?
If I could, I just wanted to get back to something you said earlier about the grid office could implement every recommendation in here and still not be effective at improving the gang situation in Los Angeles. I'm not the one, obviously, who makes the decision on what's on our audit plan, but I know there has been some discussion that if and when we do an additional follow-up, that the at least preliminary plan is not really to focus on, okay, did they do recommendation 40A, but looking at it in a broader sense of is the program effective, and focusing on that. But as I said, that decision is ultimately made by Wendy Gruhl. So.
But that was the same thing we learned in Bridges. We used to have a very definitive audit that would say they spent their money on time, they got their checks out on time, and nobody ever looked and said, when you did all that, did they make any impact? Mm-hmm. And that was the criticism that made them go away. So, in fact, it may be instructive if somewhere in the controller's files, if we pull out the Bridges audit and see if it's much different at its conclusion as to where we are today.
Mm-hmm. I guess in a way there's two pieces. You obviously want them to correct all the inefficiencies that may be there in the program at its beginnings, but just making it a more effective and efficient program doesn't actually necessarily guarantee success. But not creating the efficiencies just makes it more likely that it won't be a success. So hopefully we do one step, we identify all the logical things that are there to be dealt with, like having an appropriate evaluation when you've paid for it. And then there's the second step of whether it actually works and how we make sure that happens.
To go back to a point about the development of staff, the SNL program was expanded. We had positions added to it because in previous years that program was run by regular grid staff that would be sidetracked from their normal duties to run the program. There are different levels of intervention work being done as it relates to the SNL program, and the issue of intervention workers not having the ability to recruit members to the park, we have not heard. And if that is the case, we will look into that, but that's not information that we have heard. My understanding was that we're working specifically pretty close with the staff of most of the council districts around those issues.
Get an opportunity to give Christine and my field office a call and ask her what is the process generated around summer night lights, and what is the contact from the folks that are putting it on, and what is their request.
Can I make one additional favor to Robert Controller's office? Just want to comment on your earlier that the Controller's issue, as stated in the report, is a lack of program evaluation. You are correct. If we go back to the Bridges, one of the areas that Controller back 10 years ago, before my time, was there was no outcome evaluation. Money was given. We could not prove whether the program is successful or not. We are not saying we are at that stage with this grid programs, but concern that we had was at the time that we did our audit field work, there was no program evaluation. The report that is received today, we did not have a chance to review it. I do not know whether it would address the concern that we raised in terms of program outcome, program evaluation, as stated in the contract. That's something that we can later on look at it and get back to you.
Just one question, somewhat off track, but for my own edification, because I'm not an expert in gang programs. So the program rolls out when there has been a shooting.
That is one component of the program, sir.
Well, I don't understand how that works and what's accomplished by doing that.
Well, the goal of that is to reduce the potential for retaliatory shootings. Our intervention workers are not capable of solving a particular homicide that took place. What they do is to roll out, along with LAPD, the mayor's office, to prevent potential retaliation, either due to rumors, misinformation, conflicts between neighborhoods, etc. So as it relates to crisis intervention, which is one component of the intervention program, the goal is specifically to reduce retaliatory shootings as a result of that particular homicide. In order to more efficiently do that, we're now moving towards an intervention version of CompStat, so that particular shootings in a neighborhood can be mapped out and intervention workers know which areas they need to pay more attention to by using those tools. So that is the component of crisis intervention as it's provided by intervention workers.
How effectively does that work? I mean, have you found a way to quantify that? Do you have a sense of
We're in
how
the
many
process.
retaliations you're able to avoid?
Well, at this point, we're in the process of designing that. There is, other than the information that we get from our collaboration with LAPD, there has been nationally no evaluation done on the effectiveness of intervention work because of the ability to, how do you measure something that didn't occur? So the only way to do that is to measure the overall crime reduction in the neighborhood, and that design is being now articulated with the urban institutes. That's been one of the issues in evaluating intervention.
But I always thought when we talked about prevention, intervention, that one of the criteria was going to assess the lesser number of people that are in gangs, the lesser number of people that are in need of the service. I thought that was part of the.
It is. There are
not
two.
just the end result.
No, it's not. There are two components to that. One is the prevention component, which reduces the number of youth that may join gangs, and that's what we call our prevention program. And what I was asked by Councilmember Koretz is the crisis intervention component of what we do. So there are two separate programs.
In 2.5, almost 3 years, what has been the reduction? Because I think we're still floating about 40,000+ identified gang members.
What we have been working on is the reduction of risk factors that determine whether a youth may join a gang or not. And in this current evaluation process, we will look at how many of those youth are still gang-free, if you will.
Okay, but has that number dropped?
I don't have that information at this time, sir.
Because it'd be important to know if we started 3 years ago with 40,000, are we still at, I think the number in the report shows like 41,000.
Correct. That is a figure that is very, as you well know, very fluid, because we don't know how many of those folks have been on that system for many years, how many of them. Those figures come from Cal gangs, and we're working with LAPD to get an accurate amount of, or an accurate figure of how you measure gang membership.
Yeah. But the one thing that has always been a strange thing is that if they still, what do they call it, they go through the file and they take people out of the file after 5 years. I remember at one time they were purging over 5,000 a year that had not had contact with the police for 5 years. So when you look at those numbers, you could probably theoretically think there's probably half the file is on its way out.
We're currently working with those figures with LAPD to determine what that reduction is. The issue of how we count gang members, I believe it's a volatile one because it's a fluid number.
Yeah. All that somebody has to say is, I am one. It's self-identifying.
It's a fluid number.
And if you get the names mixed up, you could be in there several times. So, but that's what I'm saying. If you go back and look at the purging method, at least at one time they used to purge every year and take out over 5,000 people each year that hadn't had a contact for 5 years. So if you go back and look at those at the 4-year level and the 3-year level, you're probably talking about half the number of gang members are in the file at any given time.
That I wouldn't hypothesize on at this point, sir.
Just a 3 o'clock thought.
Well, any other questions? If not, we should ask for you to come back with a report in the Controller's office once you've had a chance to digest the more recent evaluations. what do we think is a reasonable period of time from the Controller's Office perspective to have you review that and come back to us?
Once we get it, maybe in 45 days.
When you come back, could you tell us what was the issue on bridges when it left, and if it compared at all?
Yeah, we can do that.
So I make it the first meeting of ours after the 45-day period. So sometime, beginning of October, presumably. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we held the consent items until you were here for a majority vote. If we could ask that item 2, 4, and 5 be note and file on consent.
Is the people still here on 2? I just had a question.
Sure.
Is some staff here for number 2?
Do we have folks in the Controller's Office and maybe CRA folks?
Or we can catch them at council if they're, is this going to council? I just have one question. In dealing with one of the recommendations that talks about defaults and things of that nature.
Yes, sir.
I know several years ago, it was a standard practice, particularly probably CDD and CRA, that converted loans into grants at some point during the process. And we could never figure out what the criteria was. It was almost as though in some of it, if you got tired of them not paying back, you just said, let's convert it to a loan, to a grant. But now, how does that impact when we start talking about defaults and people paying back? Because the only one I've seen that we seriously dealt with, or two that we dealt with on defaults, we had one just recently over at my district where we actually took property. There are 2 houses that they had used as collateral because they didn't pay their note. And then we had one on Vermont where we've actually forced, they were going to sell the property and we forced them to pay what was owed plus a delinquent bank note that was owed. And so, but again, for years we've had that policy. Have we now changed that, or we deal with it on a case-by-case basis, or just how do we deal with that whole default converted to grant issue?
We don't do it.
Is that recent?
Last few years.
Yeah.
If a loan is in default, the loan is in default, and we try and figure out some kind of methodology to resolve the default. Either,
Are you with CDD?
No, I'm with CRA. Stanley Lefko with CRA.
Okay.
Okay. We'll try and figure something out. If nothing works, we'll go ahead and foreclose on the property.
Okay, but figure it out means that you figure out how they can pay it.
Either figure out how they can pay it, or restructure the payment schedule, but no, we don't arbitrarily convert them to grants.
Okay.
No, we
What
don't
about
do that.
CDD? Is that no longer a practice?
I cannot speak for CDD, I work for Controller. So.
Okay, is anybody here from CDD? Okay. But again, if that's no longer a practice, it resolves my concern, because that seemed to be the going practice several years ago, that when something got to a point of you couldn't collect it, it became a grant, and we acted like the money didn't exist.
No, we don't do that.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
So note and file that one
Yes.
as well. So that brings us to item number 3.
Item number 3, City Controller reports relative to its performance audits of controls over the city's phone lines.
And if we could start with the Controller's Office giving us the status of the recommendations.
Sure. Cynthia Varela with the Controller's Office. On January 14th, 2010, the Controller's Office issued a report, the performance audit of controls over the city's phone lines. Our audit objectives were to identify whether internal controls over long-distance calls are sufficient to prevent and detect abuse by employees, and to review ITA's process to identify and disconnect idle phone lines and realize cost savings. Our audit looked at phone bills for March, April, and May 2009 for calls made from the period November 2008 through April 2009. We looked at controls at 6 different departments, which included the controller, fire department, police department, personnel, cultural affairs, building and safety. And then we also looked citywide for long-distance calls placed by the 311 call center and the use of telcodes and phone costs. Just to give some perspective, the city spends approximately $7.2 million annually on phone call charges and monthly access charges. $1 million of that is for call charges, with approximately $200,000 that's attributed to long-distance calls made by city employees. This amount also includes what the city must pay for calls made by the public to toll-free constituent service lines. Overall, we found that ITA has controls to deter abuse and excessive calls, but the effectiveness of the controls is limited because the policies are not adequately enforced or communicated. We noted that there's no assurance that departments are reviewing long-distance charges for appropriateness. What we found is that departments are reviewing them, but they don't do it in a consistent manner. Everyone has a little slightly different way of doing it. The monthly phone bill charges are not adequately reviewed by ITA. We identified several unusual items that appeared on monthly bills, incomplete from numbers where you couldn't tell what the full phone number was, unusual telcodes, and excessive calls. In a couple instances, we saw a phone line with over 10,000 calls being made, so very quickly the calls were being made. Not all city phones require a telcode to make a long-distance call. You may know this if you're going to place a call over 16 miles from the place of origin. You usually have to put a 5 or 6 digit number in order to access that line. International calls made by the 311 call center on behalf of city staff are not adequately controlled. We found forms were incomplete or non-existent to identify the requesting employee, the department, and the requesting employee's supervisor's name. We also noticed that the city may maintain unnecessary toll-free phone numbers. In 2004, the city had 151 toll-free lines. And at council's request, this was reduced to 107 with an average of 85 numbers with current call activity. What is important with this is that calls to toll-free numbers are billed at a per minute long-distance rate and not a flat rate as the 311 calls if you go to that service call number. So it's important to have the fewest number of toll-free numbers necessary to serve the public. With regard to idle phones, ITA had proactively initiated a review of Centrix phone lines to identify and eliminate unused or idle lines to minimize costs. This was all done before our audit. ITA identified more than 6,000 idle phones with a potential cost savings of approximately $132,000 per month. This is a very good effort on their part and should be part of an ongoing periodic review. At the time of the audit, we noticed that unused lines were not disconnected for 60 days. They would do a soft disconnect. Basically, the phone couldn't be used, but we would still get charged for that. That meant the city would incur $264,000 during this time for those lines if they weren't disconnected. I think that policy has since been changed. We did receive ITA's plans to implement the recommendations. That was on July 26th, and we found that the planned actions were acceptable. We have asked for target implementation dates for several of the planned actions, just to know when those corrective steps will take place. There were 3 responses to the report that we've re-emphasized our intent for the department to take action. 2 of the responses deal with having ITA staff periodically verify departments are reviewing long-distance charges for appropriateness and to develop data queries to identify questionable charges. ITA has indicated that staffing shortages will not enable them to implement these recommendations. And with the last response, the one of the three that we had questions with, dealt with developing a policy for the mayor and city council to review and approve a policy that requires all city employees, including elected officials and their staff, to use a telcode for long-distance calling. ITA indicated that this is a policy decision for the mayor and council to consider, and we agree with that. But what we had intended is that ITA is the lead agency for communication services to present a recommended policy for the elected officials to consider.
Thank you. A few questions. First of all, I know we have long-distance calls within the city of Los Angeles. Is it cost-effective and worth our time using telecom codes to call from one part of LA to another? Are we actually saving money? And should we be discouraging people within the city family from calling from one office to another when they need to, as opposed to a truer long-distance call, beyond the city boundaries?
Randy Levin, General Manager, Chief Technology Officer. We have, since I've been here for 3.5 years, have been actively working on reducing all of our telecom costs and continue to do so. We were charged with moving from the state contract of CalNet 1 to CalNet 2, which anybody that used those contracts in the state, which most public agencies do, required us to move to CalNet 2. One of the components of CalNet 2 was to define the use of telcodes within a 16-mile radius of the hub, say, of City Hall. And so anything beyond 16 miles was considered long distance, and we then implemented the telcodes, which I do think overall has been effective. It's not used on every single phone line. It will never be used on every single phone line. That's because we have phone lines that are alarms. We have phone lines that are lease lines for data. There is a sufficient number of lines that we keep internal to the city for operational purposes that will never have a telcode. So what we're doing now is, and we have been doing also, is a couple of things. One, where we have what the controller referred to as the Centrex lines, we have been actively working on either eliminating those or transferring them to what we call PBX lines, where we don't get charged nearly as much because they're within our internal infrastructure. So we continue to do that, and then we will be sending out some more communications on dialing, because the way we've now updated and implemented our technology, you can call another office beyond 16 miles with the regular 213 or 310 or 818 or whatever it is, regular phone number, and it won't cost any more than if you had done an internal number like 83311, whatever it is. So we've been.
It won't hold the number and require you to enter that code.
Right. So we're working on a lot of the behind the scenes technologies for continuing to reduce the phone charges. Out of the 6,000 lines that were cited in the CAO report, let's see, on January 14th, actually it says there were 11,890 lines and we had eliminated 6,600. We've eliminated now about 5,000 more. So we effectively have about 1,600 lines of Centrex lines that we're waiting confirmation on. I have to say that, and I have stated this before, that AT&T's records are insufficient for us. They are. Their records are insufficient, so we will go back to them yet again and try and figure out where these lines are. We have a big city. Their record keeping is poor, but yet we're billed for them. And the city attorney has stepped up and is going to be helping us so that we don't have to run around the entire city and figure out exactly where these remaining lines are, given particularly our labor shortage.
Is there not an easier way to do it, such as by usage? So if there are phone lines where only 1 or 2 calls a month are made, we still need to take a look at those.
It's the same records we get from AT&T. What they don't do is some of those lines do not show an exact physical location, so they may not show any usage for a while. In some cases, that's appropriate, particularly if it's an alarm or an elevator line or something of that nature. We need to know exactly where they are in order for us to deal with the last 1,600.
And What about toll-free lines? Is there any real reason why we keep any toll-free lines?
For the most part, the departments request toll-free lines. I can tell you, in the last couple of years that I've been here, I'll be driving in and I'll hear on the radio that a department is setting up a new 800 line, which is news to us. So I don't think that we have direct control over the number of 800 lines. I think we're down to 40 now from what we had before. Is that right? Something about that. So we've been actively reducing them. I don't think we'll ever completely eliminate them either, but again, we've been actively reducing them.
And the controller's office, I thought, gave us a much higher number, so I don't know if that's a recent improvement.
Like I said, we're continuing to drive down these costs because the actual usage is increasing. And we're trying to balance this because with the internet, with data, with trying to go out, all of that, those are all communications lines and costs. So we know that there's an increased demand, so we're trying to decrease the cost while increasing the capacity.
What's the advantage to us with any toll-free line?
Well, you see people advertise it, call 1-800, the city of LA, and it sticks in people's minds more than it is to call 311. Or if it's a specific program, like when the gang people were here. So sometimes it's associated with a particular program. They could just call 311, but as being the owner of 311, where we've had staffing reductions, I'm not necessarily sure in that way it's more economical to call 311, but particularly if it's a very specific purpose.
Yeah. I think one of the things that they probably a lot of the 40 may be in the police department, and they have to do with 24-hour numbers for people that are calling in on crime. Mm-hmm. And they also have an answer machine attached so that if you miss something, you can pick up clues at a later time. So
right.
Some of them are appropriate. I don't know whether 40 is appropriate, but certainly some of them are.
And what about elected officials' offices compared to others in terms of telecom use? Are there some electeds that have asked for some or all of their phones not to be on the system? And can we require that, and how much would we save?
We would have to calculate the savings. I don't know. But there are some elected offices that have asked for, phone lines to be unrestricted. There also have been some public safety components that have asked for unrestricted also. And, based on talking to the general manager in those departments, it seems that those were warranted for public safety purposes. We can, dictate that all elected offices use telcodes, but you guys would have to help us with that.
And actually, the audit report indicated that there's about $100,000 in long-distance charges that are attributable to lines without telcodes. So you're talking about $100,000 citywide, and you would have to assume that some of those are legitimate phone calls. So the amount that you're talking about that would, perhaps be questionable is under $100,000.
And obviously, presumably many of those are legitimate. It's just a convenience not to have to dial the code. So
correct.
It might be a small enough number that it may not be worth focusing on too much.
Right. I think one of the things to keep in mind is the overall telecom spend that ITA manages. For fiscal year 08-09, the spend was about $15.2 million, and that's for all internet data lines and phone lines. And for 09-10, we were able to reduce that by almost $2 million. And we also reduced our communication services budget by that much. So if you're looking at the grand scheme of things, there's ways we can reduce our budget in larger arenas that we've been focusing on.
And was that before we removed most of these phantom phone lines?
No, that's with the incorporation of the phone lines that were removed. Also, due to the reduction in city staff through retirements and other, just people leaving the city.
And I know there was a question of how 311 operators might make overseas calls. Why would a 311 operator be making an overseas call?
Most of the phones have restricted access and can't call overseas. So actually, we have better record keeping. If we can have 311 place a call, we'll know who it came from and why they were calling. And we are keeping a very robust log now. We weren't before. And so just from a control perspective, it's easier for us to do that as opposed to just opening up a phone line for international dialing.
And so on behalf of a city employee, they might be calling for a police officer who needs to talk to a witness or somebody in another country. That's largely the department that we're calling on behalf of is LAPD.
And have we set that up yet to make that happen?
Yes, it happens now.
Any other questions?
One of the things I think that I agree with many of the points in the audit, but I just think you're giving the wrong organization the responsibility to make it work. Randy can't make the general manager of Rec and Parks do anything, but the mayor can. And that's who they report to, and that's who should be given the responsibility. Randy should be in a situation of auditing what comes to her, but her taking the energy and effort to go over and say to Rec and Park or any department, I want you to do better, she probably can use her time a lot better because they're not going to pay any attention to her. And so the issue is that the audit should reflect that there is a problem, these issues are such, and that the mayor's office should be the one taking the lead on working with general managers to comply with the rules. And then Randy should be given the job to tell us they're not, or here's a policy that I recommend. But I just think it's a position that you can't survive, or we will not have a better program if you're asking the general manager to influence another general manager on something that they believe is a convenience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually, the recommendations as far as making sure that those phone bills are being reviewed and that the departmental telephone coordinators are doing that, the recommendation was made, it's addressed to all of the general managers. It's on a citywide basis.
But I think the dilemma is if she's not getting their cooperation and they're not doing it and she just gets a pile of paper, nothing happens. It should be the mayor's office through his deputy mayors telling general managers that this is an expectation. And then when she gets them, she's getting far less work because they've at least done some of the work. Now, she may fine tune it and say, you missed this or that, but to give her a pile of paper every month and say, start from scratch, and you can tell right off the bat whether somebody's auditing them, because if they come to her pressed just like they came in the mail, she knows nobody's looked at them. But the key is, there's got to be some effort from the mayor's office to say this is an important issue and you need to support ITA, but to say to ITA, you got to go through these mounds of paper and make it better, that's not reasonable.
So let me ask a follow-up question on that. How cooperative are our different departments being? I know there are some areas, a broad range of issues where we try to push individual department heads and it doesn't always happen, but my perception, and it may be off, is that we're not getting that much pushback and people are actually making some progress in this regard.
Well, I'd say it's medium, with the departments being resource constrained when they look at their list of things that need to be done. This isn't number one on their list. It's not low on their list, but it's not number one. I'm being very candid here. I think, each department has a telephone coordinator. In some of those departments, they do an excellent job, and some others, it's not. It's kind of hit or miss, depending on what the department is. And so we're trying to work, with the telephone coordinators, and as much as possible, then notify the general managers if we see anything egregious. But it's very difficult for us to determine the reasonableness of some of the phone calls. We can look at anomalies, but we don't know if things are reasonable or not because it's based upon the departmental need. So, nobody is malintentioned. I think people are stretched and they're trying to figure out where do they spend their time and resources. So they do a decent job at this. Could they do better? Yeah. I'd also say that with the ERIP and the amount of people that have left the city, we've seen a I'd say a steady demand for keeping lines as opposed to dropping those lines. And that's requiring more manpower on our end to follow up for why they continue to need it when people have left the city.
Well, that's one thing. We have over 4,000 positions that have been cut, and we're asking for more lines.
We're not asking for more, they just won't allow us to disconnect the ones.
I know, but the issue, we wandered through your office yesterday after a meeting, and it looked like, it was an abandoned building. And so you go through there and you see all those cubicles, and I'm sure with 4,000 positions, there's several of those issues of looking throughout the city, so that we should be looking at whether we're condensing space and phones and
Right.
a variety of other things.
That would really drive down our costs now, would be facilities consolidation, because it cost us to disconnect a line and reconnect it again. And so we're trying to avoid that cost, and the general managers are aware of that and are trying to do their best not to, incur any additional costs. But I think since so many people have left, it would behoove us to look at facilities consolidation, because that will not just drive down, it will drive down other costs too, not just the telecom costs, but it certainly would drive down our telecom costs.
Now, in the short term, why are we trying to keep 4,000 phone lines?
Well, we've
Oh, it's
reduced some. We haven't kept 4,000, but, in some cases, a phone may be for a group, a phone may be for, a number of people that kind of rotate in and out of a certain space. In some cases, they are holding on to them because they think they're going to bring back 90-day hires. What else, Laura? Do you have any other, or?
Those are the primary reasons that they are bringing somebody in from the field to use that office space, something like that.
One would think it should be more like intuitively 1,000 of those being kept and 3,000 being removed. And how could you possibly justify keeping most of them when most of the people are gone?
How many would you say we've been asked to keep?
I would say about 8% to 9% asked. A lot of those are being shared number. They're like, for example, recreation center. That number shows up on the city phone, but actually the whole center, everybody, all the employees in that same rec center share the same number. So any shared number, we just keep it. We won't disconnect them because they're actually the main number going to that facility.
But I can't understand that 80 or 90% would be shared.
Well, not 80, 90, and a lot of those are just PBX line, meaning a city's
Right.
switch lines. Those doesn't really
Cost us anything, I know.
cost very minimal. They're not like $20 per month saving. They're like 20 cents. We usually just put those resources back in the reserve for the next, as a potential resource for the new hire or future use. We don't actually go out and disconnect the PBX switch lines.
Yeah, I think at a minimum, we'd probably want you to report back to us on that, because that seems like there has to be a certain amount of wastage in keeping 80% of those numbers.
Well,
So
we'll
if you
set
can
it up.
figure out
Yeah.
what's going on, how many of those are valid and being maintained, and whether there are 1,000 or 2,000 that we should be cutting back, there could be at least modestly significant savings there that we should hear about. So maybe you can report back at a minimum on that item to the committee in what seems like a reasonable period of time.
I'm sure we could do it next month.
Okay, why don't we do that at our first meeting after 30 days from
Okay.
this meeting? And any other things that we think we should report back on in this part?
Yeah, I was going to ask you one other thing on the issue of the lines, telecode numbers. That's something that we should be putting the emphasis on, and people that are not using them, because that's where historically we've had abuses. What is it? Whatever the chrono lines or whatever, people were on those for decades and stuff. So, but and I think one of the things that may be helpful, if you find, and again, every elected official is going to do their own thing, but at least under the council, if there appears to be abuses, I think it's a matter of sending something to the president of the council and saying, here's your usage. There is a consistency of 2 lines per office, but one office has 22. I mean, so that they're fully aware of that. And I think the president of the council is very sensitive to where it appears that there's some abuses or waste in that regard.
Okay. That'll take us a little longer to pull together because all that reporting comes from AT&T. So we could report back, but that one will take us probably 2 months, I would think.
And one other thing, which I think would be more complicated than a report back, but is a good idea that came from this discussion, is facilities consolidation. I don't know whether we should create some sort of a broader working group or whether you need a motion from us to do it, but in some way, I think we'd like to kick off an effort to look at that. There could be significant savings in exploring that.
There's the MFC, the Management Facilities, Municipal Facilities Committee, and I think they're chartered with doing that, or they're in the process of creating a subcommittee right now to look at that.
Yeah, I think Tony's looking at that, ITGA.
If we could then just informally pass on our encouragement, how's that?
Absolutely.
If there's any way that our committee can help facilitate that, we would certainly express interest in doing so. I think.
Controller's on it.
Make a note of that.
So, and other than that, I thank you for coming, and
Thank you.
we are adjourned. Oh, and actually, let me unadjourn us just to say that we'll note and file that item for now.
Very good.
And now we're adjourned.
How you doing?
Bye.
Good to see you.
Yeah, there's essentially is there, so that'll are those briefing notes?
No. We had coordinated this office, they coordinated in the past, and we've all recommended, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Apparently, there was a disconnect last night, and so, well, not last night, but routinely. And so I'm just touching base, just to make sure that if you don't have it, I could,
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, feel free to send me whatever it is you think they wanted. I mean, there's